Chapter 6. Bitterroot Creek ran into the ocean on the eastern coast of the island. It was a sheltered spot, with plenty of overhanging trees growing right down to the water's edge to provide concealment, even for a craft as large as a wolf ship. The water was deep right up to the bank, and it made an ideal landing place for raiders. Will was cantering Tug down the winding path through the forest towards the creek when he heard the sound of galloping hooves behind him. He turned in his saddle and checked the horse with a touch of his heel as he recognized Sir Norris galloping after him on his battle horse. The battlemaster was fully armed and armoured now, and the steel-shod hooves of his massive grey left a cloud of dust hanging behind them. The dog, who had been loping silently to one side of the track, keeping pace with Tug, dropped on her stomach as the ranger horse came to a halt, and watched the approaching horse and rider with her head cocked curiously to one side. Norris reined in beside Will. The battle horse was at least 4 hands taller than Tug, and the horse and rider towered above them. Will inclined his head in greeting. "Sir Norris," he said, "what brings you here?" Norris hesitated. Will had a good idea what he was about to say. After a few seconds' hesitation, Norris answered him. "I can't let you do this on your own, Ranger," he said, the note of bitter self-reproach evident in his voice. "It's my fault we're unprepared. I've let things go soft, and I know it. Now, I can't leave it to you to pull my chestnuts out of the fire for me. I'll stand with you." Will nodded thoughtfully. It had taken courage to say that, and just as much courage to make the decision to accompany him to face the Scandians. He felt a new surge of respect for the battlemaster. Perhaps if this turned out all right, he might prove to be a blessing, he thought. The arrival of a raiding wolf ship had certainly rammed home the lesson that Seacliff Fife was underprepared, and it did so far better than any criticism that Will might have voiced. "I appreciate your offer," he told the knight, "but it might be better if I did this alone." He saw the colour rising in the other man's face, and he quickly held up a hand to calm his anger. "It's not that I doubt your courage or your ability," he added. "Quite the opposite, in fact. But I think I have a better chance of settling this on my own." "You surely can't plan to fight them alone?" Norris asked. Will shook his head, a little smile touching his lips. "I don't plan to fight them at all if I can avoid it," he said. "But your presence, in full armour and mounted on that huge horse of yours, mightn't give me a choice. Think about it," he went on, before Norris could interrupt. "At the first sight of you, obviously ready for battle, the Scandians are likely to attack without further thought." Norris chewed his bottom lip. What Will was saying made sense, he realised. Then the young ranger continued. "On the other hand, if they see me alone, they might be willing to talk. We rangers tend to have an unsettling effect on people. They're never quite sure what we might be up to," he added, the smile widening. Norris had to admit that was true. Yet he was reluctant to leave the young man to face the odds of 30-1, armed only with a bow. Will saw the hesitation and continued, his voice crisper now as he realised that time was running short. "Besides, if things go wrong, I can always outrun them on Tug here, and pick a few of them off as I go. Please, Sir Norris, it's best my way." He glanced down the track, looking for the first sign of the Scandians, knowing they would be coming this way as there was no other path up from the beach. Abruptly, Norris made his decision. On his light, agile horse, the ranger could take to the shelter of the forest if need be, or simply outrun the Scandians back to the castle. The sea-wolves rarely used bows or other missiles. "Very well," he said, wheeling his mount. Will nodded his gratitude as the knight set spurs to his horse and began to canter clumsily back the way he had come. As the hoofbeats faded, Will took stock of the ground around him. At this point, the path ran relatively straight for 50 meters in either direction. The trees were set back and the ground was level, leaving an open space. This would do as well as any other spot to meet the Scandians, he thought. He could keep them at a distance if he needed to, and had room to maneuver. He backed the horse up a dozen paces or so, then stopped in the middle of the path. The dog, belly low to the grass, loped back beside him and dropped flat. Will glanced up at the sun. It was a little behind him, so it would be in the Scandian's eyes. That was all to the good, he thought. He shrugged the deep cowl of the cloak up over his head and settled the longbow comfortably across his saddlebow. The position was ready without being overly threatening. Tug's ears twitched, and a fraction of a second later, the dog let out a low warning growl. Will could see movement in the shadows under the trees at the bend in the path. "All right," he told his two animals, "settle down." He eased his seat in the saddle and slouched comfortably, waiting for the Scandians. Gundar Hardstriker, skipper of the Wolf Cloud, stepped out into the afternoon sunlight from the shade under the trees. At his back, 27 Scandian warriors marched in double file. His eyes a little dazzled after the dim light of the forest, Gundar stopped in surprise at the sight of a solitary figure on the road ahead of them. Not a knight or a warrior of any kind, he saw. It was a slightly built figure on a small, shaggy horse. There was a longbow held almost casually across his thighs, but no sign of other weapons. No axe, no sword, no mace or club. His men straggled to a halt behind him, fanning out to either side of the path as they moved to see what was causing the delay. "A ranger," said Ulf Oakbender, who pulled the bow oar on board Wolf Cloud, and Gundar realized he was right. The sun's dazzle, almost directly behind the waiting figure, had stopped him making out the mottled cloak that was the sign of a ranger. Now, as his eyes adjusted, he could see the strange, irregular patterns that seemed to shimmer and move with a life of their own. "Good past noon," called a clear voice. "What can we do for you?" It was the surprisingly young voice of the speaker, as well as the fact that he used the traditional Scandian greeting, that caused Gundar to hesitate. Behind him, he heard his men muttering, as puzzled as he was at this sudden appearance. They had expected either resistance or flight from the people they encountered, not a polite inquiry. Realizing that he had somehow lost the initiative, Gundar called angrily, "Step aside! Step aside, run, or fight. We don't care either way. You choose." He started forward, and the figure straightened slightly in the saddle. "No further." The voice had a ring of authority now, and no sign of any indecision. Gundar hesitated again. Behind him, he heard Ulf's low voice. "Be careful, Gundar. These rangers can shoot like the devil himself." As if he heard Ulf's whispered warning, the ranger continued, "Keep coming, and you'll be dead before you take another 2 steps. Let's just talk a while, shall we?" Gundar, conscious of the eyes of his men on him, snorted disdainfully and started towards the rider. He saw a brief blur of movement. Recalling the incident later, he had no clear recollection of what the movement was. The strange, shimmering, mottled pattern of the cloak confused the eye, and the ranger moved at lightning speed as well. But he heard the savage hiss thud, and an arrow was quivering in the ground, its head buried directly between his feet. He stepped back rapidly. "It could have been between your eyes," the voice said calmly, and Gundar realized that it was the truth. He lowered the battle-axe that had been resting over his shoulder and leaned on its hilt as its head touched the ground. "What do you want?" he asked, and the figure shrugged. "Just a few words between friends. I wasn't aware that the Hallisholm Treaty had been rescinded." "The treaty doesn't ban individual raiding," Gundar said. He thought he saw the figure nodding, although it was hard to tell with the cowl of the cloak covering his head. "Not in so many words, perhaps," he said, "but Iraq Starfollower is said to disapprove strongly, particularly where it concerns his friends and their property." Gundar laughed scornfully. "Friends? The Orbial doesn't look for friends among Araluans," he said, although a worm of doubt was wriggling in his belly as he said the words. There was a pause. The ranger didn't answer his question directly. Instead, he looked at the sky and the low autumn sun. "It's late in the raiding season," Will said finally. "I assume you've been raiding the Gallic and Iberic coasts." It was an easy assumption. There had been no word of any raiding on the south coast of Araluan. Now, watching the group before him, he thought he understood why they had landed here. "It'll be a long, hard pull across the Stormwight at this time of year," he said, maintaining his easy, friendly tone. "The autumn gales will be starting soon. You'll winter at Scorgil, I suppose." He saw the ripple of surprise go through the Scandians. The leader glanced at his men to silence them. "Scorgil? What do you know of Scorgil?" "I know it's a black rock, hundreds of kilometres from anywhere. It's wet and freezing and totally devoid of any comfort or even a single blade of grass," Will told him. "But it's still preferable to crossing the Stormwight in bad weather." He paused for effect, then added casually, "Or at least, it was when I was there in Wolfwind." Now that had an effect, thought Will. Wolfwind had been Iraq's wolf ship before he had been elected Obial of the Scandians. Yet there would be very few Araluans who knew the fact. Scandian ships didn't have their names painted on them. He saw the group muttering in low voices, saw the uncertainty in the stance of their leader as they realized that the only way he might have known the name of Iraq's ship would have been to know Iraq himself. That was precisely the thought that was going through Gundar's mind. Yet he hadn't made the obvious connection. Ulf had. He grabbed his leader's arm. "It's him," he said urgently. "The one who helped defeat the Eastern Riders." Gundar peered at the figure on the horse. He'd heard of the young ranger apprentice who had fought side by side with the Scandians 5 years ago, but he'd never seen him. Gundar had been up country during the brief, bloody war with the Temujai. Not so Ulf. He'd taken his place in the shield wall during the final confrontation. Now, as Will tossed back the cowl of his cloak and the shock of unruly hair was visible, he recognized him. "It's him, Gundar," he told his captain, then added with a grim laugh, "As well you stopped when you did. I saw him empty 5 Temujai saddles in as many seconds during the battle." That wasn't all, Ulf knew. If this were the legendary apprentice he was thinking of, then he was a close friend of the Obial, and raiding in his territory might not be the best career move a wolf ship's girl could make. Iraq was renowned for his loyalty to friends and his short temper with those who offended them. Gundar, not the quickest of thinkers, had reached the same conclusion a few seconds after his deputy. He hesitated, not sure what to say or do next. He and his men had an urgent need that had influenced their decision to raid Seacliff. They needed provisions to see them through the long, bitter winter months on Scorgil. The Bear Island provided a safe harbour for wolf ships, but little in the way of food, and Wolf Cloud's crews had been anything but successful when it came to capturing supplies. If they sailed to Scorgil as they were, they would quite possibly starve to death. At best, they would go very hungry. Gundar and his men needed to raid. They needed meat and flour and grain to see them through the winter. And wine if they could get it, he thought, his tongue unconsciously licking his dry lips as the thought crossed his mind. Friend or not, he thought, the Obial could hardly blame him for looking after the well-being of his crew. "Ride away, Ranger," he called, making a decision. "I'd prefer not to raise my weapon against a friend of Scandia, so I'll give you this last chance." He hefted the massive axe again as he spoke. He was a little disconcerted to see a smile touch the young man's face. "How very kind of you," Will said pleasantly. "And if I do ride away, what do you propose to do?" Gundar pointed in the direction of the castle and the attendant village that he knew lay some way beyond the trees. "What we came here to do," he declared. "We'll take what we want and go." "You won't get much with only 10 men," Will said in a reasonable tone of voice. Gundar snorted angrily. 10? I've got 27 men behind me." There was an angry growl of assent from his men, although Ulf didn't join in, Gundar noticed. This time, when the ranger spoke, there was no trace of the pleasant, reasonable tone. Instead, the voice was hard and cold. "You haven't reached the castle yet," Will said. "I've got 23 arrows in my quiver still, and a further dozen in my saddle pack. And you've got several kilometres to go, all within bowshot of the trees there. Bad shot as I am, I should be able to account for more than half of your men. Then you'll be facing the garrison with just 10 men." Involuntarily, Gundar's eyes swung to the tree line. He realized that the ranger was right. He could fade into the forest and keep a constant fire on them as they tried to reach the castle. "Try to come after me, and you'll just make it easier," Will added, and Gundar swore explosively under his breath. Mounted as he was, and with a ranger's skill at avoiding detection in the trees, Will could evade pursuit easily while he cut the small force of Scandians to ribbons. The wolf-ship's girl felt rage boiling up inside him. He was trapped here, with no options left to him. On the one hand, if he didn't raid the village, he and his men would starve. On the other, if they tried, a lot of them would certainly die. Will watched him carefully, waiting for the right moment, just before the rage boiled over into frustrated action. "Alternatively," he said, "we might be able to come to some arrangement."